All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I'm joined by a panel of special guests. So, in the first place, we have the open theist, David Kemball-Cook. Hey, David, how's it going?
Oh, hi, Dale. Yeah, I would say that I'm a theist, but open theist maybe not.
You're not an open theist. I thought at one
Well,
point when we did the problem of evil, didn't you say you leaned that way, or did I?
yes, in leaning that way is not the same as being in that camp.
Okay, okay.
But
I stand corrected then. So, all right, cool. And the to my left, we also have the heretic himself, David Russell. Hey, David, welcome
What's up,
back.
buddy? How you doing?
Yep, it's been a while.
Well, I might be a heretic, but I'm not Satan.
At least you're not Canadian. There you go. So, and underneath, we've
We all
got
know the devil is from Canada. No, I'm just
well, Justin Trudeau, yeah, maybe. But you guys got Joe Biden, so I don't know. So, but down below, we've got the ultimate Eastern Orthodoxer, Tyler Fowler. Hey, Tyler.
What's up, Dale?
Hey,
Glad to be here.
You've been quite busy on Faith Unaltered. I think you have like 4 shows a week now or something like that. So
We've been pumping them out, bro. So we just hit the 2,000 subscriber mark. Thank you all for making that happen. And yeah, we've been pumping out episodes left and right. We've got a couple new segments and then one in the works. So maybe hosted by our female friend Carrie Griffel. So yeah, we got a lot of stuff coming out.
awesome. All right, cool. Well, basically everyone knows the format for these shows with David Kemball-Cook. He was a former biblical Unitarian, and he's now lost his faith in the Bible. So we've been kind of talking to him on, what are his reasons for leaving and trying to provide some kind of counter to address those issues. And today's issue is really his doubts pertaining to the historical evidence for the resurrection. And on that front, since we are limited for time, I want to go straight over to David KC. And why don't you lay your opening case as to what's your issue with the historical evidence for the resurrection?
okay, well, thanks, Dale. Yes, I should say first off that I'm obviously a skeptic now. I was a believer, and up till about 2-3 years ago, I was leaning towards belief in the resurrection still. But as I lost my faith, the dial dipped below 0.5, if you like. So I now believe that the resurrection is less probable than not. And the second thing I want to say is that I'm assuming that we're here talking about the bodily resurrection, a physical resurrection, that the tomb really was empty. And but obviously not all Christians believe that we have to believe that Jesus was raised bodily, believe in an empty tomb. But I'm assuming that all you guys do, and that's the issue that we're talking about. I mean, that's what the Jews of the time would have believed about a resurrection, that they would have thought it was a nonsense that somebody was raised from the dead if his body was still in the tomb. So, that would make no sense.
David,
and that's what,
just to kind of clarify quickly, not to interrupt your opening, but are you, by making that distinction, are you saying if we were advancing a spiritual resurrection, you would be okay with believing that? Or
well, I think the arguments are different, and all the argument about an empty tomb, which as you know, the apologists place a lot of emphasis on, William Lane Craig, Jonathan McClatchy, and so on. So if we're going to talk about a spiritual resurrection with no need for an empty tomb, then it's rather different. And then we're talking about visions that Jesus appeared to the disciples in the same way that he would have appeared allegedly to any believer over the last 2,000 years, including Paul. So it's a pretty clear distinction here that there are two different issues, really. I mean, we could move on to the spiritual side of it, but I'm assuming that what you want to talk about is the physical resurrection.
Yeah. So go ahead. I'll let you give your opening uninterrupted.
So I've done a little PowerPoint just to lay out where I think I'm coming from. So that might take 5-10 minutes to go zip through.
Yep.
We could talk about it as we go along, or we could just wait till I finished and then talk, if you like.
Do you know how to set it up then? if you
Yeah.
see
So what do I
present,
do?
so if you see the
Present.
present button at the
Present.
bottom,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then it'll pop up a little box saying,
Share screen.
yeah, share your entire screen, kind of thing,
Okay.
just
Right.
at the tab.
Okay.
And
Share
then
screen.
click the
Mhm.
picture, the image of the screen there.
Yeah.
It'll highlight
Okay.
blue.
Oh, where's it coming?
Is that,
Yeah, I can't see it. Where's?
oh, you can't see it?
I might have to close something. All right, I'll just try again and close some things. So let's see, what can I close? Okay, can't close those. Just try again. So present. I'll put up there first.
Present, then share screen. And then
Okay, present.
Share screen.
Screen.
And then do you see a little box?
So it's giving me different options for my screen.
Yep.
And it's showing
Just to keep
it's got all my my tabs. It's showing me all my tabs on Google Chrome.
Yeah, great. So so you're under entire screen then. So click the little image in the middle of the box. It'll highlight it with a blue border.
Oh, entire screen. I see up there. Good.
Just to make it simple. And then click the little image in the box, right? It'll get a blue border, and then click share. And here it is. It's popping up. So then go to what you want. Resurrection of Jesus. We're seeing that now. So yeah, go ahead.
Great. Okay. You can see me. Good. Right. So we're talking, as I said, I think we're talking about the hypothesis of bodily resurrection. And if we were to talk about spiritual resurrection, that would be different. But talking about the bodily, we want to look at what the evidence is, what the arguments for it, the arguments against it, and my conclusions, obviously. So the hypothesis here is that Jesus was raised bodily. That means, that the eating fish, being touched, etc., as the gospel accounts describe. And I'm just calling that resurrection from now on, and distinguished from visions. And the relevance of the ascension here is that, according to mainstream Christianity, that any appearances of Jesus after the resurrection are non-corporeal because he's ascended to heaven. So therefore, the appearances to Paul are irrelevant to the resurrection hypothesis. So the encounter in Acts 9, described in various Acts passages and 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians later on, are all to do with visions. And indeed, that's what those passages say. None of them say that Paul saw Jesus eat fish or touched him. They're all visions, a light, a sound, a voice, and so on. Okay, evidence. Well, this is stating the obvious. This is what we have. Secondhand reports in text written 2,000 years ago, at least 20 years after the events they describe. And that we've got those claims in 1 Corinthians 15, but we don't know if those were bodily appearances or not. The indirect evidence we have, I'm talking here about evidence that supports the resurrection, which is in the early chapters of Acts. People believed, I think, for a part, to a great extent, arguably because of miracles done, and indeed the miracles described by Paul. Sorry, this is word with signs following Mark 16 as a summary here, that part of the reason for the growth of the church is that miracles were done by the disciples, by the apostles, by Paul and by Peter and John. And then, of course, the evidence of the growth of the church, there had to be some, X factor that made the church grow. And unlike any other messianic movement of that time, which did not, died out. So arguments for, well, we could say the Bible tells me so, but as I said, I'm coming from a position of skepticism here. Sorry for staying on that. And I was just talking with a friend of mine, assistant pastor at my church, and we were debating this very subject actually, and just the other week, and he said, "Well, do you believe Jesus was raised from the dead?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Why not?" Well, I said, "I don't believe the evidence is enough." And I asked him why he believed it, and he said, "It's a matter of faith, it's belief." So obviously, we can believe that the Bible says it, therefore I believe it, but that's not enough. We could also have personal experience. So if we've had an experience of Jesus appearing to us, we're very likely to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, and many people have had that experience. I haven't, but many Christians have. Minimal facts. So this is the argument put forward by Gary Habermas and others. Maximal data is something that I think Jonathan McClatchy terms. Based theorem approaches. This is the paper by the McGrews, which you've already linked to, I think, Dale, in your previous shows on this topic.
Yeah.
And so to each of those in turn, the Bible tells me so. That's not an argument. Personal experience. Okay. But this is not an argument either. I mean, it's obviously a convicting experience to go through, but it's not an argument. So, you're not going to persuade anyone to believe in the resurrection by telling them that you've seen Jesus. It's not an argument. Okay. So, and the minimal facts, you might say, well, William Lane Craig doesn't put forward minimum facts. Well, he does. He does in a way. Just that his facts vary. And the crucial, important question here is, where does the empty tomb come in? Now, it's a really important break, if you like, in the argument for the resurrection. And so William Lane Craig places emphasis on it. But Habermas used to include it, but more recently he leaves it out in his list. So this is his Habermas's list from 2016. And I look at all these, and you guys will be familiar with them. And I would say, well, yes, I could believe that. I could believe those five. I could take, for the sake of argument, I could accept those as a skeptic. I could accept those. But how do we get from there to believing that the resurrection is, my personal probability, subjective belief is more than 0.5, that I think it's more likely than not that the resurrection happened. So I hope you see where I'm coming from here. I can look at these facts and say, yeah, these, I can say Acts is, written with a bent for historicity. Certainly the authors of Luke and Acts were trying to be historical about the early church, how it grew, the experience of Saul. Saul was a real person, that his letters reflected his personal beliefs. We can accept the kernel of truth in the gospel accounts that Jesus died by resurrection. And then, importantly, that the disciples really believed they'd seen Jesus alive after his death. So I could accept all that, but how do we get from there? So that's the question, really, I think that we're, might be considering. So how do we get from the apostles or disciples having a strong belief in the resurrection to it being highly probable for me? Okay, now proponents use this trilemma argument. So I think Lycona does, William Lane Craig does, McClatchy does. I don't know what Habermas does, because everything I've watched of his, he never says what his argument is. He just lists the facts. But anyway, the trilemma. And either the disciples were lying, or that they had a hallucination, it was an illusion, or it really happened. And of course, they argue against the first two, but come to the third, obviously. But then, as Paul Ogier points out, they omit really the obvious go-to from a skeptic, which is a legend. And this is rather funny in a way, because in some of their arguments, they say, let's go to the most likely or most popular amongst skeptics, liars or hallucination. But then they disregard them as being unlikely. But the legend, I really go with Paulurgia here and say that a legend can grow up in a matter of weeks, and that Peter might have had a belief that he saw Jesus, and that might be being transmitted to the disciples. So we can come back to that, but the maximal data is where the McGrews really don't. Unlike Mike Lacona, they really want to insist that the Gospels are historically reliable. But then, if that's so, then we don't need to argue for the resurrection separately, because the Gospels record the resurrection. And if the Gospels are reliable, then obviously the resurrection happened. So, but maybe they're talking about the McGrews and McClatchy on two levels, really, that the Gospels are genuinely historically reliable. So Lydia McGrew has a book recently talking about the reliability of the Gospels and talking about these undesigned coincidences and other things. And therefore, so that's one level. And the second level would be then to say, okay, so the resurrection accounts in particular are reliable, but then we might need an extra argument for that, such as the trilemma argument. So, yeah, so I mean, that's, problems with one, that we can't get, we can't prove that the Gospels are universally reliable in every detail just by showing by indirect arguments that some of it is reliable. The argument, I mean, that, for instance, the famous resurrection of the saints in Matthew 27, 51 and 52, I think, that those two verses, there's no way that you could establish that those are historically reliable just by pointing out that, or establishing that the rest of Matthew's gospel is reliable. You can't establish that. Secondly, the problem with two I've already raised, the trilemma, is it omits the legend. So that's the argument there. The McGrew paper, I read that a few years ago and I was impressed by it, but I can't imagine now why I was so impressed, because it has numerous flaws in it. They have to define what kind of probability, and I think there may be 7 different kinds. They choose arbitrary values for the probabilities that they're, hugely small in many cases, but they're arbitrary. They pluck them out of thin air. They assume that the gospel accounts are true. Well, then you could just take the resurrection there, couldn't you? So that's really not a viable assumption in this context. So just want to forget about base theorem altogether. Paul's testimony they use, and that's one of their factors, but it's irrelevant to the bodily resurrection, as I pointed out above. They assume that the witnesses' evidence is independent, and that's a huge plank in their argument, because if events are independent, then the probability, say 2 events happening and they're independent, the probability of them both happening you get by multiplying the probabilities. So if you multiply 2 very small numbers together, you get an even smaller number. So 10 to the minus 10 multiplied by 10 to the minus 10 is 10 to the minus 20, which is infinitesimal. But there's no way that you can get away with assuming independence between the different appearances, because gospel accounts can't be considered independent. Then also they compare resurrection with not resurrection, but that's not fair, because you have to identify specific naturalistic explanation for the evidence that we have, not just generally not are. And they say 13 witnesses. Now, I don't see how they get 13, because Paul was not a witness to the bodily resurrected, and there weren't 12 in the upper room or wherever. There were just 11. So I think that's just sloppy. So quickly moving on. Against then, although we're going to say that to be a skeptic, you don't have to prove the resurrection did not happen. You just have to say the arguments for are not convincing. But you've got Hume's general argument against miracles. You've got arguments specifically against the resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus, and then skepticism. And this is the famous statement by Hume. And what we're doing here is really just we're comparing probabilities here. We're comparing the probability of the data, testimony or whatever, and the testimony is true versus the probability of the data and the testimony is not true. You're comparing those two probabilities. And I think that's right. I think that's what we would do. But I think it's common sense. And indeed, in assessing these probabilities, we should indeed take account of the fact that people don't usually rise from the dead. So we'd normally require very strong evidence for resurrection to prefer it over any naturalistic explanation. And I think you would agree with me. In general, that's what we would normally do. But if we're going to be talking about probabilities here, then it's subjective. There are different kinds of probability, but what we're talking about here is our own subjective belief probability. And if we were going to use Bayes' theorem to refine it, that would bring in what are called prior probabilities, which are the probabilities in advance before we look at the evidence. And of course, those are very different for different people. So an atheist, their prior probability of resurrection will probably be 0 or near 0, whereas for a theist, the prior probability would be much larger. And then the Bayes' theorem works by calculating, multiplying the prior probability by the probability of the data given the hypothesis divided by the probability of the data given the other hypothesis that you're comparing it with. But anyway, prior probabilities are crucial. So arguments against resurrection specifically, well, some atheists bring out, comparisons with other religions. So that, which is on the face of it quite a strong argument, but then apologists would attempt to rebut this quite reasonably by pointing out that Christianity is different. And it's not really a debate that could be settled one way or the other. But we don't need to, because my position and any skeptic would say the best position is being agnostic. We say we don't know. I'm certainly not prepared to say the resurrection did not happen, but I'm not have enough evidence to convince me that it did. So there we are. We might, yeah. So on my comment to you, Dale, on your last show, is I did put this in the comments below, is that we could actually, I believe, have enough evidence for a modern day resurrection. If someone came back from the dead last week, I think Mike Lacona on one of his, I think maybe on Capturing Christianity said, supposing somebody, I get beheaded, and then 5 minutes later, I walk out with my completely alive again. We could say, well, and the beheading took place, under television lights and everything. We could say, yeah, that it looks like this really happened, because today we've got evidence. There's video evidence. We can talk to eyewitnesses. There might be hundreds of people there, and all that stuff. But for 2,000 years ago, it's a different case. So 2,000 years ago, a gap of at least 20 years between events and recording, all we could have is a probable belief. And as I think the Paul Logia's rival hypothesis is that a mistaken belief of, say, Peter or Mary, that they had seen Jesus, could have grown into the stories in the gospel, with many details accrued in the retelling or supplied by the authors of the gospels. And as he points out, legends can come about in weeks or months. We're talking here about years. So that's
right.
That's mine.
Awesome.
So
Awesome.
How was that?
Yeah, no, thank you for a very thorough presentation in terms of how you take arguments for the resurrection. So I'm wanting to turn to my two co-hosts to kind of give their take. But just before I do, I have 3 things I would like to quickly just ask about or go over and stuff quickly. So David, just as a quick answer, one of the Bible tells me so was the first argument that you or approach that you sort of knocked down. And I think you were kind of giving a bit of a straw man of thing, because I can see where the Bible tells me so approach could actually be successful if we are warranted in believing that the Bible as a whole is sufficiently attached to the truth of Christianity, or is inspired by God. In that case, that's why I believe I don't require a historical minimal facts approach or something like that to prove that Jesus turned water into wine or that he was part of the Red Sea. In that case, the Bible tells me so is a warranted argument because it comes attached with argumentation saying that, well, these stories as a whole are attached to the truth of Christianity, and I'm warranted in believing Christianity is true. So do you recognize that someone could make a Bible tells me so argument that is warranted? It would just require more than just saying, well, the Bible tells me so. There also has to be additional premises there.
Yeah, yes, I accept that. That's a good point. And but personally, I'm not in that position that I'm not willing. I certainly would say that I'm a theist, but that doesn't mean any point of view about the Bible being warranted that the Bible is true.
Fair enough. Cool. Okay. The other thing I thought it was interesting that you kind of critiqued the minimal facts approach and then the maximal facts approach of like McGrew and stuff. Now, are you familiar with any what's called the moderate facts approach? And our buddy Caleb Jackson deserves the credit for coining that term. But I, for example, take a moderate facts approach. I've linked to Caleb Jackson's book on my blog where he takes this moderate facts approach. Are you familiar with any of those approaches?
No, I've never heard of it.
Okay.
So yeah, enlighten me.
Yeah, no. Well, it's basically moderate facts, right? So we require more facts than what Gary had, just the minimal facts that someone like Gary Habermas or William Lane Craig would give us, but we don't require the full maximum. We don't have to believe everything in the Gospels and stuff. So it's kind of in between.
Does it include the empty tomb?
In Caleb Jackson's case, it does. In my case, it doesn't. Right. So it depends who you're talking to. Right?
Okay.
So, yeah, I'll send you a link to his book.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and the last thing, I kind of just want to give a bit of a lecture because the prior probability. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly here. So I did a show on Skeptics and Seekers called Calculus for Christ. And Tyler, you'll like this because I explain what is Bayes' theorem, how does it work, and what's the formulas and stuff like that, specifically related to the resurrection. And one of the things here is related to the prior probability, right? So just for the audience very quickly, this is the formula that you would use for Bayes' theorem, right? So what's the probability that the resurrection is true given the evidence that you have and your background knowledge or your prior knowledge? So it equals this formula, right? So you have the probability of that we would see the evidence, that we would have an empty tomb or these appearances, given we assume the resurrection hypothesis is true.
Dale, are you trying to share your screen?
I am. Am I not sharing that?
It's not sharing. I just added it.
Okay, cool.
You're gonna have to switch over to show your. There you go.
Is that showing up now?
Yep.
All right, awesome. So as you can see here, here's just the formula kind of thing, right? Actually, this is a screwed up one, but the point here is, look, you have the probability of the evidence given that the resurrection is assumed to be true times this is the prior probability factor. What is the prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis would be true given our background knowledge, right? And the problem that I hear from skeptics is they never do what's actually necessary. They just assume that it's always low because they'll give some kind of reference to, well, billions and billions of people have been risen, and what are the odds that Jesus would be risen from the dead? But that's the wrong question. Look, that's the wrong reference class. Jesus wasn't just some random peep. He was a religiously significant prophet of God and or agent of God in one sort, or God if you're coming from a Christian perspective, but whereby God would have had a religiously motivated reason, or could have had at least in terms of prior probability, to raise him from the dead as a special case. And that's what you've got to ask the prior probability on. So on that front, there's actually a thing called the Jeffrey conditionalization formula, where we can calculate out this factor in Bayes' theorem. And in order to do that, look, you have to find out what's the probability that the resurrection will be true given the background knowledge. times the prior probability that God exists on the background knowledge that we have, plus, and this covers naturalistic ones, right? Like the probability that the resurrection of Jesus might be true, given our background knowledge and the fact that God doesn't exist, times the prior probability that God doesn't exist on the background knowledge. And you have to add these up. So I've never seen a skeptic really do the hard work of filling out all of these factors to come up with a true probability. They usually always just assume, oh, well, this prior probability, this prior probability right here is very low, as David Hume argued. Yeah, but this prior probability is very high. This factor may be very high. So is this, and this might be very low. That's the point that I wanted to make here, is that there's actually a formula called the Jeffrey conditionalization formula, and David Hume didn't know about this. Probability calculus didn't exist in his day, so he was just wrong. His argument was incomplete. So that's the last thing I wanted to say, but I'm going to shut up because I'm the host on this, and I want to go straight to David Russell. What's your kind of opening take? What do you want to tackle David KC on?
Well, I mean, I don't have anything specific for tackling, I don't think. I mean, you said it pretty well, and you know what, some of the points you brought out was probably some of the points that were going through my mind as well. I did have a couple other nuanced ones. There's a time, and it's a little story, but I was doing an apologetic against another guy that I knew, and we were just going back and forth. And it was weeks upon weeks. We were just presenting the argumentation and this and that. And then I gave him my own experience, and he said, that convinces me. So arguments from experience, I just don't dismiss. And I'm not saying you do either, David, because I'm sure there's probably nuance to what you said, but you just kind of asserted that you can't do it. And I would say that we can make an argument from experiences because not all experiences are the same. And because of that, there are other factors that could make a good argument from experience. And I'm probably sure you would agree with that. So that's that. And then I had an issue with the reliability aspect, and maybe you explained it while I was writing it down, but just came to my mind. Why can't I establish that because a source is reliable in its content in most in every other instance, and in some areas, why do I have to assume that? Or why can't I make an argument where, you know, like you gave the example from Matthew and the saints rising? If everything else in that book is reliable, can I take it on good reason? Don't I have good reason to believe that would be reliable as well? So I'll let you answer those two first.
Okay, what was the first one again?
Well, just write it down, David. But I do want to make sure Tyler gets his opening in before we do the discussion.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine.
So,
go ahead, Tyler. I'll leave it with those two.
Yeah, Tyler, you're being told to wake up. Apparently, you were sleeping during my Jeffrey conditionalization formula.
So I don't know how many times I've said this on Faith Unaltered. I don't think I've said it any time on Real Seekers, but Jamie's a follower of Faith Unaltered, and he should know this. And I know David and Dale knows this. But if I'm sitting here and Dale's explaining something that is, I'm trying to take in everything without any distractions. So you cut off one sense, you know. So I wasn't sleeping, Jamie. I was trying to listen to Dale, what he was saying. But beyond that, I will keep this very minimal. That was a pun, by the way. Just kidding. I will keep this very minimal and just reference a couple things from your presentation, David. And it seems to me, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong on this here in a little bit, but it seems to me that if David's applying the same standards that he's doing to the Bible and the New Testament, specifically the New Testament, to any other document in history that didn't happen within the last, David's lifetime or within the last, let's say 100 years, then everything from Plato to Homer to anything even more recent than that would be up to be judged by skepticism, right? And it seems like David's approach would win out, so to say, and we would have a probability to be skeptical over anything. because it seems like a double standard that, David, you're applying to the New Testament that you don't apply to any other documents in history. The second thing I'll say is, in order to understand the Bible, and this is why I don't like only evidential apologetics, and I'm more with David on this, David Russell, is because we have to step in to a Jewish worldview. We cannot take our standards that we've developed in the 20th and 21st century, apply that to the Bible, and then say, no, it's not good enough, right? The Jews operated under this idea that testimony is indeed the way that you discover truth. By the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, it says it in the Torah, says it is reiterated again in the New Testament, but by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, this is how we establish what truth even is. And so to say that, well, there's not enough evidence, you're not operating on the same functions as the Jews of their time were, because they weren't writing to people like we are today, right? They're writing in their own context, in their own settings, and in all honesty, they didn't have those standards that they were, or they weren't relevant to them, I should say, in their context. The other thing that I heard was, how do we get to the resurrection, right? Out of all these different steps that you took in your presentation, David, and I say this with respect, but how do we get to the resurrection? Well, how I get to the resurrection is by Occam's razor and looking up all of the possibilities. The facts of the matter are, the witnesses that wrote down what we have today in the New Testament, they're the ones that claim there was an empty tomb. Okay, I don't buy this whole spiritual resurrection thing. I think it's a bodily resurrection. I think this is what Christians have taught for 2,000 years now. But what other explanation would we have for a empty tomb scenario, you see? And I think that Mike Licona, I think that Gary Habermas, and all the people that argue not only for the historical reliability of the New Testament, but also touch on the resurrection as well, they've done a really good job of laying out another, the case for Christ. Lee Strobel, he does a really good job at this in his book, but laying out the differing options of that could explain even an empty tomb. And none hold, in my opinion, none come even close to explaining the empty tomb like a resurrection would. And so you have the swoon theory, which Jesus didn't really die. You have this idea that's purported in the Gospels that the disciples stole the body. And so, touching on kind of 2 birds with 1 stone here, the idea of a spiritual resurrection I don't think is found in the New Testament, because you have those arguments like the disciples stole the body, this, that, and the other. But then the other aspect of that, Occam's razor, to exclude or eliminate other opinions and other scenarios in which an empty tomb could be explained. I think the resurrection is the best attested explanation to that, in my opinion. But then again, that's taken in a whole lot of presuppositions that we don't have time really to get in the next 20 minutes of this discussion. So I'll leave it at that and leave people to think about that.
Hey, Dale, if you don't mind, I did want to address one more thing, and it's not really a question for David to answer, but just a kind of a pushback. Is apologia, sorry, his legend argument, and you quoted this as well, and I would just push back that there's a reason legendary developments don't pop up within weeks. They can right in these days, because we have internet, we have mass travel. But for something to develop legendary back in a historical context, especially in ancient context, it's not probable, because these guys only traveled maybe 7 miles from their home in their entire lifetime. So there's no room for that, and legends would have been countered by the people that were alive at the time. So with that in mind, we have to realize the historical context of where these people lived, and that's kind of backs up what Tyler's saying as well. So I just wanted to add that in, Dale and David.
Okay, cool. So, all right, cool. So at this point, I want to devote the rest of the time of what we have left. And David, Casey, are you cool if we maybe go a little bit over just the 1 hour mark a bit?
Yes, sure. Yes, Dale. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll turn it to you. Who do you want to engage with and have sort of
okay? Well, I could just try and reply to all the points that I remember. Yeah.
There's a lot. We apologize.
Okay. So, Dale, yes, if we have a general belief in the reliability of the Bible, I can see how that would raise the prior probability of resurrection, certainly. But I'm not starting with that. So, indeed, I'm very skeptical about some of the things that are in the Bible. So, and you're using everywhere in your presentations, you use God univocally as meaning only one thing, as if everyone understands what or who God is. But the concept of God is a highly varied concept. Varies obviously from religion to religion. And to be a general theist, as I class myself, is not to align myself with a belief in the Christian God at all, or anything to do with the Bible. On the moderate facts, I'd like to see that, but the empty tomb is something that I'll raise with Tyler. The talk about how we use Bayes' theorem, that was very interesting, but of course I haven't had time to study it. But certainly what you showed on the screen is mathematically true. But we've got to look at where these prior probabilities come in. And of course, anything that raises the prior probability of God is going to raise your posterior probability of the resurrection. So I'd agree with you there. But I'd like to, so if you can send me a reference for that would be good.
Yeah, I'll
Uh,
post up my slides. Again, this is from my show, Calculus for Christ. So I'll post up my slides on my blog
Right.
for anyone. Yeah.
Okay. I thought David made an excellent point about if a source is everywhere else reliable, then is that not good evidence to trust one particular section? And yeah, I think that would be so. So I think we might look at Acts, for instance, where we think that the author is making efforts to be reliable historically, as we all know. And so we might say, well, everything that certainly this author certainly reports in the first person, we could trust that as historically accurate. And so, yeah, I would say. But in the case of Matthew's gospel, yeah, my skepticism is not over that particular instance, but also the birth. Well, Matthew does seem to be not following the model of what we would call a biography. In other words, he is putting in stuff to make his case, not actually putting in stuff that he thinks actually happened. The flight to Egypt, for instance, seems to have been inserted there so as to justify the prophecy made in Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son, Hosea chapter 11, I think. And if you compare the birth narrative of Matthew with that of Luke, Matthew 2 versus Luke, they don't fit together at all. There's no way you can get a flight to Egypt lasting several years in between in the time of Mary's purification, as reported in Luke. I'm skeptical about Matthew, and a lot of other people are.
Can I ask a clarifying question, David?
Go
ahead.
Yes, sure.
I'll ask it here in a minute. Go ahead.
Okay, well, when you come back. I'm not the only one there. A lot of Christian apologists do admit that they don't necessarily. I think Lycona is one of them. Would say that they don't actually go die on the hill of accepting that the appearance, the resurrection of the saints actually happened. And I think there's some embarrassment there about that passage. Experience. I didn't quite get what you were talking about experience, but I repeat my point there that if someone really believed they'd seen Jesus, they would certainly believe in a resurrection. And I'm sure that's how many people come to faith, Christian faith. But maybe you can come back and clarify in a minute. Tyler, yes, you make a good point there about double standard. But no, I really think that Hume, if Hume were alive today, he would stick to what he said. And I think what Hume said is common sense, is that we need really better evidence for a miracle than we do for something ordinary. This is just common sense, whether it happened last week or 2,000 years ago. So other ancient events we have, when you've got multiple historical references for, say, the assassination of Caesar, which you do, and some of those accounts are by contemporaries, like Cicero was around at the time, then and that Caesar was assassinated was not a miracle, but on the contrary, it was highly credible that he was assassinated, then there's evidence to believe it rather than that he had a twin brother who was killed in his place or something like that.
So David,
so
when you
I'm not applying a double standard at all. I think any ancient text that reports a miracle, and there are lots of ancient Greek texts and Roman texts about Romulus and Remus, that I forget which now, but various miracles or totally supernatural things happen.
So David,
And we
I'm
sniffed
gonna
them out there.
David, I'm gonna jump in here just to be as efficient as I can with the minimal time that we have. Why don't we pick out individual issues, starting with the ones that are most important to you? So like one by one, and then we can kind of discuss for a little bit and then move on to the next issue after like 10 minutes or so. Do you think that will work? Or
okay, yeah. I mean, just give me 1 minute to finish.
Okay.
Jewish points of view, yes, but Luke who wrote Luke's gospel, and Paul who wrote his letters, they were certainly Luke we believe was a Gentile. Paul was writing in Greek with a Gentile education to Gentiles.
Paul was a Pharisee.
But just because they had different standards doesn't mean that we should accept what they say is true. The empty tomb, yes, but then this is the thing, is if we accept the empty tomb, then there are strong arguments for resurrection, but then I'm skeptical about the empty tomb. Okay, and the empty tomb, if we could talk about that, because if you could argue me into accepting an empty tomb, then I'd be halfway towards belief in the resurrection.
So I just want to respond because it was so fresh to what you just said, David, about, I think you missed my point about stepping into a Jewish world and a Jewish context. Luke, being a Gentile, was indeed associated with the Jews. I would argue that Luke was a proselyte even to the Jewish tradition. But the point I was making is, in that worldview, they don't have these evidential standards that you're applying to the text today. What I mean is they're according to the law, according to the Torah, that applied to every Jew, whether they're Pharisees, Sadducees, Samaritans, whatever. They had this idea that on the basis of testimony, on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses, truth is established. So that means if I told you something, David told you something that we saw, that's enough basis in a Jewish mind to develop or to establish that this really happened. And so they're not evidentialists. That's what I meant. You're applying that standard to them whenever they didn't even hold that standard themselves. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does, yes. But I forgot to say that you seem to be assuming that we've got eyewitness reports of the resurrection, which we don't.
Why not?
Well, we don't have them. We don't have eyewitness reports of the resurrection. We don't have anyone writing saying I X saw Jesus rise from the dead.
So you're saying the copies of the eyewitness testimonies aren't good enough, is what you're saying? Isn't that all we have for Caesar's assassination?
We don't have eyewitness testimony.
Well, you mentioned Caesar's assassination, and this, I think, is a good segue into you using this double standard. You apply and argued, I think, that there were it seemed like more ancient historical testimony to the death of Caesar than there is to the resurrection of Christ. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think so. I think so. I haven't added up the historians.
Let me run this, Tyler, because this is going to support your point here. Around 12 manuscripts we have of this account of Caesar, the oldest manuscript from the 9th century, a full 900 years removed from the actual events. This list, extends to manuscripts from like the 12th century. Cicero's speeches have an even older pedigree, but we're looking at 400 to 800 now.
So there's no eyewitness testimonies, is what you're saying. These all come 900 to 400 to 800 years after.
I'm not saying that because I think you can establish historically that they're reliable. I don't hold, but what I'm saying is you have a lot less pedigree of years between the formulation of the gospel than you do even a Caesar and his life or anything.
Right. So, that's what I'm getting at. There's no autographs of Caesar's account.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah. and they're 900 years removed. So that's why
Right.
that's why I said it supports your position here on that particular aspect.
So
Okay,
then, with
David,
that,
oh, go ahead, Tyler.
Sorry.
Finish
just
off.
real quick, just a clarifying question. With that being said, David, are you skeptical of Caesar's assassination account now, or
No,
not?
no, I'm not. But I'm not following what David said at all about 900 years removed.
The point I think that David's making, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the account of the assassination that we have of Caesar comes 900 years after the historical event. Is that right, David?
Yeah, and unless you're looking at writings of Cicero, which date 400 to 800 years, about 400 CE to 800 CE, which I still think, in my opinion, is good to establish some sort of historicity there.
Well, I
But
agree.
I would be a lot more skeptical of that than I would be of the accounts of the Gospels.
See,
because
that's what
they're
I'm.
closer in origin.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I agree in your
I'm not
pedigree.
following you at all. Sorry, Dave, I don't follow you at all.
Well, let me, I'll kind of qualify to help David KC, but I do want to get to the empty tomb because that's what David KC wants to speak about. But
That's fine.
so one thing that we do have to be consistent here, I think, because the Christians, you're kind of, when you're saying, oh, it's 400 to 500 years for Cicero's account. Well, obviously Cicero was contemporary kind of thing, right? So you're talking about the manuscripts on that front. So on that front, we would have
the
to
testimony,
the manuscripts. Oh,
the testimony,
that's a
the
different
testimony that we
issue.
get. So how do we
the
know that
actual-
Caesar was assassinated? Is because we look
the
into the
accounts.
historical research, right? And the historical research we have that Caesar was assassinated comes by way of manuscripts, right? And testimonies, right? So the same is given with the Gospels, and they're a lot closer in origin to the actual event than any that we have of Cicero's documents.
And
So
because-
things could have been altered and stuff like that. I mean, you'd have to apply more of a skepticism for Caesar's assassination than you would for the life of Jesus Christ.
Right.
Well, I don't think so. I think Cicero's diaries were written down in a matter of a few years after Caesar's death. I mean, there's no reason to.
Right.
he was
Yeah, and that's
He
the
was a
thing I was saying
contemporary.
is that we don't have, but we don't have any of those diaries until hundreds of years after.
Yeah,
it
we're
has
not
taken place.
talking. I see Dale's point. We're not talking about the autographs. We're talking about the actual accounts, which were copied, maybe uncopied, but that's true of all ancient documents.
Right. We don't have
So,
autographs for any original ancient.
No. So indeed, but that's not the issue here. We do accept that that documents can be copied and preserve a high degree of reliability, and historians can show that to be so by looking at different versions of the same document and see the amount of corruption, or But you get the gist. I mean, so I don't think that's the issue here. The issue here is that we have fairly contemporary accounts of Caesar's assassination, or Tacitus or Suetonius, written some years later, but relying on what was apparently common knowledge at the time. So there's a public appeal there to something that was universally agreed that it was that it happened. And the second point is, of course, that it wasn't not a miraculous event, whereas the gospel accounts of the resurrection were written by people who believed it happened. So there's a definite bias there. And secondly, it was a miraculous event. So we are entitled to apply a higher degree of evidence for something miraculous. And Hume was right there. Hume was right. We do require a higher standard for some miracle than we do for something normal or everyday. And to Tyler, I just repeat my point that we do not have eyewitness accounts. We don't have a letter of Peter saying, I saw the risen Jesus. We don't have a letter from Mary Magdalene, anything like that. We don't. So we don't have witnesses. We don't have, reports. We have third-hand reports, second-hand reports.
I'll just respond by saying that I think it's very interesting that what you do with Caesar and his assassination with documents, because we don't have eyewitness reports of them either. What we have is copies of the manuscripts that allegedly were copied correctly, but we don't know what those autographs said with Caesar. But then, and I'm trying to show you, David, that this is the double standard that you're applying, is that whenever we have manuscripts after manuscript after manuscript of the New Testament writings in particular that come from within. And you say that there's no letters from Peter. There is. It's called First and Second Peter. Now we can agree or disagree on whether or not those writings actually came from Peter. I think that'd be an interesting conversation to have. But according to the church tradition, those letters did indeed come from Peter. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, and then we can move on to the empty tomb. I know we're running short on time, is that I just find it faulty in your reasoning. I mean that with respect, that you're not applying the same standards that you do to Caesar with documents that come hundreds of years later than you do with, I mean, we're finding copies of the Gospel of John in the 1st century now. I mean, that's amazing if you ask me. But then the New Testament textual criticism that's applied to all of these that span centuries after the fact, they all seem to line up, especially on the resurrection. And I'll go one more step to say that if indeed someone can show me that the resurrection of Jesus is wrong, then I'm not a Christian anymore, because of what Paul said in his letter to the 1 Corinthians, and that which, if Jesus hasn't been raised, then Christians are to be among men most pitied. That's a bold statement from a Jewish Pharisee that converted to Christ after witnessing him on the road to Damascus. So I'll just leave it there.
Gotcha.
Okay. Right. So, Tyler, thank you. Now, witnesses. I think it was you that brought in witnesses, not me. 2 or 3 witnesses. That was one of your arguments here. And of course, witnesses have to be eyewitnesses, otherwise they're not witnesses. So it was you brought in the witnesses thing, and I pointed out that we don't have any witnesses. Eyewitness of the resurrection.
I would argue we do, but
if we accept 1 and 2 Peter as authentically,
well, you got Matthew. You've got
nowhere in those letters does he say, "I saw the risen Jesus." So those are not eyewitness accounts of the resurrection. But you brought in the witnesses. Now, secondhand accounts, history is based on secondhand accounts. You know, obviously it can use first-person testimony when available. You know, Abraham Lincoln's assassination, there might have been first-person accounts of people coming out of the theater who say, "I saw this and it was written down." But, you know, usually it's secondhand and written from around people who use the knowledge at the time to write things down as secondhand. So we can accept those. Certainly we have to, and historians do. We do that all the time. However, in the case of a miracle, we require a higher standard of evidence. And that's where I think Hume's argument is absolutely on the nail, is that we do need a higher standard of evidence for a miracle than for not. And we actually do this in all, you know, we don't accept the mythical accounts of the Greek and Roman history. We just accept the factual. We strain it through a sieve. We say that, you know, one bit here.
David, I just have one question.
Historian will bring in a mythical account. Sorry. But we know that that's in kind of inverted commas. You know, we know he doesn't really mean that it actually happened.
Yeah. I was just saying sorry for the interruption, because it like kind of you're cutting out there, David, on my end. It's probably just my internet chopping out. But I would just come back and just ask, what would you accept as good evidence? You know, I mean, this whole idea of Hume's incredible evidence, but there's no standard in which you could say, well, what is this incredible evidence? What is this incredibility? Well, yes. And you're saying we don't have eyewitnesses, but my point with the historical aspect is that we have an account of John that is an actual second-hand account. When you're looking at other historians, you're looking at third, not even third, you're looking at fifth, maybe 9 hands later. You know what I mean? So we have an actual document, we have an actual manuscript of the Gospel of John, who I would say was an eyewitnesses. And, you know, I don't know what type of direct statement, why that a direct statement versus he appeared to the disciples and it's the disciple actually writing it down, that wouldn't count as eyewitness testimony. So I would just, there's a lot going on here, but I will confer it to Dale again. I'll let him push to the empty tomb. Or whoever wants to respond. It's whatever.
Well, I'll step in as host just to make a quick announcement, because I've been trying to, again, with the time stuff. I think the best way to approach this, and David, KC, let me know if you think this is a good plan, is, look, there are 3 essential elements to constructing a historical argument for the resurrection, the bodily resurrection. So the first is on this issue of the sources that we're using, the historical sources. The second is, okay, what facts can we glean and how do we glean those facts? And then thirdly, we have the explanations or the explanatory hypotheses to explain those facts. So I'm thinking it might be best to split this up into three shows, focusing on each of the topics. So yeah, I'm happy to let you guys, let's focus on the sources. There is one question from the audience that's on the appearances at the end, but for this episode, let's focus on this question of sources for the remainder of the show, and let's see if we can establish anything that way. So let me start things off. David KC, are there any of the historical sources that are you in the New Testament or anything, or even outside the New Testament, that you think are valid and can be used to establish facts?
Yes, of course, and we have history books made out of what historians wrote about ancient times, and so we can accept some things with a high degree of personal probability. I think we go back with the Roman Empire. We can go back to several hundred years BC because we have contemporary accounts there that are surviving. Obviously, not necessarily in the autograph forms, but
I'm kind of asking about the resurrection specifically.
So and these things are related to us as facts, aren't they? And so history books are written on the basis of these generally accepted facts and dates, indeed. But where there isn't as reliable evidence, we can't be sure.
Okay, so with respect to the resurrection specifically, are there any sources in the New Testament or elsewhere that you automatically accept, yes, this is a valid source of information, or are you skeptical of all the sources?
No, I said I think that the author of Acts is attempting to write history.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you take
in comparison to the author of Matthew, who I believe is not trying to write history?
Okay.
And hold on, that's what I wanted to ask earlier, is why it be, and you mentioned the flight to Egypt, and I got kind of confused at that point. So why don't you believe that Matthew's writing history?
Well, because he seems to insert stuff which, for the sake of for an apologetic criterion, that these things happen so that you might believe, and so that to show that Jesus is the. I mean, read commentaries of Matthew, and you pick this up quite clearly, that his purpose is apologetic to encourage belief in a Jewish audience.
Right, and I agree with that.
He brings in, the asses, Jesus riding in on the asses, and links to Zechariah. He, as I said, the flight to Egypt. He links to prophecy of Hosea, showing how Jesus fulfilled prophecy.
Right, historically, right? That's what you're saying, is that Jesus fulfilled these prophecies that were written 200, 300, 400, 500 years before Christ even showed up on earth. How he fulfilled these historically, right? Or no?
Yeah, but I'm saying that he made up the flight to Egypt.
On what basis do you assert that?
Well, I told you. I said
that's what I'm asking you to clarify.
If you put Matthew 2 and Luke 2 side by side, they don't fit together.
So Luke's the standard by which Matthew should be judged
I would
by?
trust Luke. I would trust Luke more than Matthew, because
but why?
Assuming that the author of Luke is the same as the author of Acts, the author of Acts takes pains at certain points to date events, and about in Acts chapter 17, the second-hand accounts turn into first-person accounts. So it appears that from that point onwards, he's writing with first-person witness accounts there. So it looks like he's attempting to write accurate history.
So just to clarify, and I'm trying to let David finish. So just because Luke writes, I did this, I did that, instead of he did this, he did that, then that gives you more certainty that Luke is writing from a historical vantage point, whereas Matthew is just a polemic?
Well, no, not only that, Tyler. As I said, that he dates things. He makes an attempt, and you can, with regard to external events, you can reference what he writes with who was governor in Ephesus, for instance, or the death of Herod. So he brings in external events, external names and people, you know, the Felix and Festus and so on,
Sure.
and appears to lay down, give us information which enables us to date a lot of the events that are described in Acts. So it looks like he's writing as a historian. He says in the such and such year of Augustus, which none of the Gospels do.
Right.
So except possibly Luke, well, certainly Luke. So it looks like if Luke and Acts are written by the same person, that this person was a companion of Paul, probably a Gentile, and attempting to write accurate history. It looks like that. I'm not being outlandish here. I think most people would agree with me.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Whereas Matthew's a different kettle of fish. He's not attempting to write accurate history. He's writing to bring about belief in Jewish readers.
Well, I think they all are writing to bring about belief. Even John at the end of his gospel says, I write to these things that you may know that Christ is the Messiah, or that Jesus is the Messiah.
Oh, indeed. Certainly they all were. And Luke was obviously a believer. But Luke was, it doesn't look like Luke, the author of Luke and Acts was making stuff up deliberately to try to bring about belief. It looks like he was reporting. So, you know, the miracle on Malta when the snake bit Paul.
Sure.
It looks to me that probably happened because he was an eyewitness.
Oh no, hold on, Tyler. Just let me jump in real quick. Yeah, I've done a lot of research on the birth narratives, and I've seen people reconcile Matthew and Luke pretty well. Maybe you could look into Lydia McGrew's work on that. I don't know if you already have. I know you got a little bit about the McGrews on that aspect, but Matthew is written in the style of Greco-Roman biography. That is verbatim. Luke is different. Yes, Luke records more of a Western style writing style that is Aiken, but I don't see Matthew making up things or this and that. I see that there's a depth of writing that we have to take into consideration because Matthew has a lot of Hebraic writing styles within his literature there. I don't think he's making things up. I think he's type and shadowing. He's using what Jews would have used at that time to produce things that would be prophetic and fulfillment of the prophecies. Just like the whole thing in the resurrection of the saints. I mean, that very well could be hyperbolic, and that would be common to Jews and many writing in that time and how they wrote their biographies of that time. So Matthew's in 5 discourses. That's common in other writings within that time. So yeah, I mean, it's just it's how you look at it. It's kind of getting into the history of it. So with that, Dale, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have jumped in. I didn't want to.
No problem.
If I can finish what I was going to say just real quick, and then
Sure.
I'll turn it back over to Dale. So to keep in mind at the same time that, you know, Luke, I believe, and I think I think a lot of scholars would agree with this, that Luke was writing to a non-Jewish audience and Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. And, you know, you brought it out earlier, David, that there is this idea within our context, within our where we are right now in history, to separate myth, and I'm not using that term like in a bad way, right? But myth from historical narrative. And that just did not apply to our Jewish criteria. For example, Genesis 1 is argued today, you know, amongst all kinds of Christians everywhere. Well, is it historical reliable? Is it mythos? Is it historical narrative? Whatever. We see, if you study the ancient Near Eastern context, right, that they tended to blend these ideas for, like what you said, polemical purposes, right? So the author of Genesis is writing to compete with, and I would argue to show how Yahweh, God of the Israelites anyway, is superior to the Egyptian gods and the other ancient Near Eastern gods and goddesses in that time. But the point I'm trying to make at this juncture anyway is that this idea that myth and historical narrative was completely separated from themselves is it's very, very recent. That's a newer development that came with scholasticism and the Enlightenment period. The Jews didn't think that way. They combined these things, and I'll leave it there.
Okay, cool. So the thing that I really want to do, I just want to establish a baseline of where we're at, because obviously I'm wanting to help David Kemball-Cook and make the best case here. So, okay, so great. So you would accept Luke, Acts as a credible source for potentially gaining facts from. You're not with Matthew yet, but you've been debating that. The other two Gospels, John and Mark, do you think those are valuable sources? Would you be able to those just as a yes or no kind of thing?
Oh yes, they're certainly valuable sources. Yes.
Okay, for the resurrection purposes.
Well, they're sources of the belief that it happened. Certainly.
Okay. Now, what about Paul's letters? Do you go with the majority of biblical scholars and accept certain ones, like the 13 of them? Would you accept all of them as valuable historical sources for the resurrection? Or
well, but they're all irrelevant to the resurrection
because Paul wasn't an eyewitness of the resurrection. That's your argument, David, right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And we don't know, as I said, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, of course, the famous passage, over 500, but we don't know of the 500 whether there was a bodily appearance to them or not.
Are you familiar, just out of curiosity, and this is just a fun question, but are you familiar with church tradition on what they teach about Paul and Jesus teaching him in Arabia for 3 years? David?
No, I can't. Well,
I
know about the 2 years. But...
Just for funsies, do a Google search of church tradition in regards to Paul and Jesus teaching him. I think you'll be interested in what that has to say.
Okay, well, certainly with the letters of Paul, there's nothing there that gives us support for bodily resurrection. Indeed, if you read 1 Corinthians 15, it gets the opposite, because he describes the resurrection of which Christ is the first fruits as a spiritual body, not a material body. And he decries as fools those who believe that we're going to be raised with that same body.
I would argue that you're misinterpreting 1 Corinthians 15, but we can talk about that later if you'd like to.
That's another show then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd love to have that conversation with you, though. We're
Yes.
talking to another guy that argues that same thing, and I think it's just fallacious. But we can have that conversation later if you'd like to.
Okay. So David, okay, great. So you're good with the other Gospels. You're good with Paul's letters where they're relevant, potentially relevant, like 1 Corinthians 15. Church fathers, you said you're not sure. Do you think there's any relevant historical data pertaining to Jesus' resurrection in a reliable source from the church fathers at all, or is that too late?
Well, they're all based upon the second, third, fourth hand accounts, aren't they? Based on the Gospels and Acts chapter 1.
Okay,
so they don't give us independent evidence. We could say that there are 3 potentially independent strands of second-hand evidence. What you've got for the bodily resurrection, you've got Luke, Matthew, and John, and of course Luke chapter 24 merges into Acts chapter 1 and the ascension. So we've got those 2 we could consider as one potentially independent second-hand sources.
Okay,
and
that's all we have.
And that's with the idea that history, or I'm sorry, the secondhand, or I forget how you worded it, but you said something about that history is built on the secondhand sources, or history is the basis of secondhand sources earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So the fact that they're secondhand sources doesn't disqualify them.
Okay.
Remember, it was you that brought in the witnesses.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we had reports of something non-miraculous, and we had 3 documents which date from that time, or 10, 20 years afterwards, which didn't just reported that Jesus was crucified and died and was buried, for instance, we could accept those, as I do, and as many people do, and as many skeptics and atheists do, because they don't report something that was miraculous. So we could accept that, and that's why those minimal facts, I was saying those 5 minimal facts of Habermas, I could accept, but that doesn't get me to a bodily resurrection, because as Hume pointed out, the bar is higher for a miracle. It has to be. And the same, if someone said to you, Tyler, that, my wife died last week, but then she was raised from the dead, you would be skeptical, wouldn't you? You'd need some evidence.
Well,
You wouldn't just believe him, would you?
I live in a Christian worldview where we can actually attest to miracles. So depending on the claim,
But you still need,
but
you still
I
need
think
evidence.
Hume's. But
What
my thing
evidence
is,
do you?
I think Hume's claim is arbitrary to this idea that miraculous historical happenings require much more evidence. Then that's only, I think, founded and could even be logical in an atheistic worldview. But that's just my opinion on that. So it just seems arbitrary to me to claim, well, this, because it's a miracle, requires more evidence. That's taking a couple presuppositions in mind.
Tyler.
Evidential
You would be
apologetics and
skeptical.
this idea that miracles don't happen in an atheistic
You
worldview,
would
right?
need evidence. It's a miracle last week.
I'm
You
not
would
an
want
evidentialist,
evidence
so
for it. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but if your friend said to you, "My wife came back from the dead," yeah, and would you just believe him because he said that, or would you look into it?
I would look
Would you
into
think,
it like
well,
I look into the history of
you'd need
Jesus'
more evidence,
resurrection.
wouldn't you?
Yeah, right. I
you'd
would
need
look into it.
evidence.
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
I would look into it the exact same way that I've looked into Jesus, the claims that Jesus rose from the dead. So absolutely.
Right. Well, that brings on to what Dale said. I mean, just to finish off, because Dale, we're running out of time, but perhaps we could carry on another time. But you asked me what would I need, and this is exactly the point, Tyler, that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
A miracle last week. You know, my friend said my wife died and was raised 3 days later. I think a miracle nowadays, potentially we could accept because more evidence is potentially available. There could be videos, there could be eyewitness reports. We could talk to eyewitnesses and all that. There could be multiple eyewitnesses.
Sure.
So I'm not against the idea of a miracle. I don't believe miracles are impossible. I think that, but they do need a higher standard of evidence to accept. Just you reporting a humdrum fact about your wife, you could accept on your friends say so. But your wife's resurrection from the dead, you'd need a bit more evidence before you believed it. You might be joking, or something else happened, or you might be hallucinating. So, but so a miracle nowadays, I think potentially there could be evidence, and I know that there's big books on miracles, aren't they? Craig Keener's book, is it? On that, and I'm not against that at all. I don't think that it's impossible that miracles happen, but a miracle 2,000 years ago is different from a miracle last week, and I don't think that there's any evidence there that we could accept that separates it from other mythical accounts in the Quran, or about what Muhammad did flying from Mecca to Jerusalem, or what what the Book of Mormon says, which is more recently. But even so, just because we've got certain historical accounts that something happened is not enough to give us belief. And if it's of a miracle kind of event.
Okay, cool. Okay, so David, one last quick question for you again on the sources, because I'm trying to gain from you what sources I can use or not, and I'm just taking whatever you would accept. So on the secular sources, then people like Josephus or Tacitus, do you think there are any secular historical sources that are relevant for establishing the historicity of the death and resurrection of Jesus, or do you see those as not useful or irrelevant?
Well, yes. I mean, they just report belief of Christians that Jesus rose from the dead.
Gotcha.
So they don't give us any more information than the early chapters of Acts.
So just out of curiosity, David, other than testimony, whether that be firsthand eyewitnesses or secondhand witnesses, whatever, what other evidence would you look for to confirm or deny the resurrection, the historical event of the resurrection?
Well, this is it, you see, Tyler, is that we don't have a distance of 2,000 years. We don't have any other kind of evidence.
Right.
For any event in the distant past. All we've got are stuff that was written down at some point. That's that's why we don't know what happened really 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, unless there's a clay tablet somewhere. It's telling us. And 10,000 years ago, we have no idea. I mean, what historical events? All we've got is archaeology, and so So yeah, so but whereas something last week, we do have a different kind of evidence available, much stronger
Right.
evidence.
Right. Because we got cameras, we've got pictures, we've
Yeah,
got all
that's
these
right.
different things. And so the only evidence that we have to examine for the historical claims of the resurrection in particular, since that's what we're talking about, are the eyewitness or the witness. I'm leaving an eyewitness there for just a second, but the witness testimony that it happened. So then we have to go and establish, are these sources reliable? Are they truthful? Can they do this, that, and the other? And is that, as an evidentialist, that I mean, that's all we have to base that on. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. And yeah, so that's all we have. Yes.
So I just got a question for Dell and David, then, just out of curiosity. Given that that's the evidence, the testimony of the witnesses of this event, right? What do you guys think? Is that good enough, or is there something else that we can base a probable belief, as Dell would say, to warrant our belief in the resurrection from the dead, or is evidence not enough? Like, what do you guys think about that? And I can clarify that if that didn't make sense.
Yeah, no problem. So I think that testimonial evidence is sufficient in the case of the specific testimonial evidence that we have. And I would disagree with David Kemball-Cook's what I believe to be a mischaracterization. I would believe, my friend, if I determined, look, these guys are reliable and I adjudicate their motivation. They're not trying to play a prank or trick me. They're sincere. And I evaluate whether I think they've gone insane or something like that, and no, they're perfectly healthy. That would be sufficient. I would believe, yeah, maybe their wife probably rose from the dead, and that's exactly what I do. So I've become a sort of a mini expert in what's called the epistemology of testimony, and I'm going to get into a lot more detail in a future show with David Kemball. I've been listening very carefully as to his objections, how I think I can organize some shows to maybe address this thing. And I want to do a show on David Hume and the epistemology of testimony. But just if you're interested, David KC, here I'm sharing I've already done a solo show on David Hume and miracles, kind of refuting his argument and giving some of my objections. So you can kind of get a head start there. And one of them is my take on the epistemology of testimony, where I take a non-reductionist understanding, whereas Hume takes a reductionist understanding. So yeah, that'll be something on a future show. But obviously for the next one, I want to kind of, outside of explanations, I want to establish, great, we have these sources. What are the facts that we can establish and are working with? So that's my sort of plan for next time, if David KC is good with that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah.
Are you asking me to answer, Tyler?
Yeah, I'd love to hear both of you out on that one.
Dale, do you mind, or are we cutting it too short?
But go ahead, as long as David KC is okay with it.
Yeah, I would say there's a few things I'd say. I'm with Dale when it comes to the idea of a friend saying, "Hey, look, my wife rose from the dead." Right? I would have unless I had reason to doubt him, I would take him at his word. And yes, I would obviously look into it. But my problem is I would only have available evidence. And that's what I would base my my determination off of, because I don't think we have a line drawn in the sand when it comes to extraordinary evidence, so I don't think that that's the case. And when you look at historicity, I'm going to quote Dan Wallace, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament, right? So as far as historically, with the Gospels and the eyewitness testimony that we have, I do believe it's eyewitness testimony. I think that John was the author of John. I think Matthew was the author of Matthew. We have good historical arguments for that. Balcom and the eyewitnesses, talking about the eyewitnesses, gives an incredible argument there. And I would say all the evidence that I see, and it's not pure, it is evidential in a very real aspect, is that he rose again, and the historical sources, I think, affirm that very well. I think that they're very reliable. For all the years that I've studied the reliability of the New Testament, I do believe that the arguments for his resurrection just outweigh by long way the arguments against it.
I think that if we had cameras and photographs, and I'll just say this in closing, that Jesus's comment to Thomas wouldn't have as much weight as it actually does now, because we don't have that. What we have is the witness testimony and the eyewitness testimony of the resurrection. But just for our audience sake, and David, take this for what it's worth with you as well. But we keep in mind that Jesus told Thomas, blessed are you, because you see, like you believe because you see, right? But blessed are those who believe and yet do not see. And I don't think Jesus there is they take this and all of what the apostles and the guys that I'm instituting take with a grain of salt and blind faith it, right? Like, but there is evidence. I think there's sufficient evidence, like David was talking about, when comparing and contrasting the eyewitness testimony, the reliability of the New Testament, and not only that, but the second-hand testimony as well, that I agree, I think Mark was a disciple of Peter. So whether he saw the resurrection or not, I think that would be up for debate, since he puts himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that was before Jesus died, by the way. But we can talk about that time. But I say all that to say that I think that there are good reasons for believing that Jesus rose from the dead. And I think that the Bible attests to that. It's been proven to be reliable. And that's one of the many reasons why I'm still a Christian over all these years. So.
All right. And so just to David, I was just going to finish off because I thought you had to go. Do you want to say something? Or?
Oh, no. I need to. I think if we could have another show, Dale,
we're going to have at least
that would be good. We've opened quite a few cans here.
Well, just to close off, David, I do want to back. There is a relevant difference between my believing the testimony of my buddy and his wife and Jesus, right? And that's that religious context. It's not on the basis of the testimonial evidence. That's the same, but it's that prior probability. Jesus is in a different reference class to God randomly raising someone randomly from the dead, like my friend's wife or something. But I just want to say congratulations to, apparently Real Seekers has hit 2,000 subscribers. Oh, whoops. That's for Faith Unaltered.
Oh man, I thought you did, Dale.
No,
I was like, yes.
I was trying to be funny, but yeah.
So man, you got
congratulations to Faith Unaltered for that. But thank you so much, David KC, for coming on. I've been listening very carefully to your objections, and we will definitely have future shows where we can kind of zero in and focus, because the whole point of this is to help you, not just give talking points on all sides and stuff like that. So you'll be back, and we're gonna dive into some of this stuff. So
yeah, thanks David for the chat. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you Dale, David and Tyler. It's been really good, really interesting, and I appreciate your courtesy and the points you've raised, some of which have been very much to the point. And I think we really need to have another go at this.
Yeah, and real quick, I'll say this too, David. Just in case that I did, I think I did a couple of times, but I do apologize for cutting you off. It's one of those topics that I'm very passionate about, and so I apologize if and when I did cut you off there.
No, that's okay. It's absolutely, and I'm sure I cut you off as well. So that's right. I mean, we're passionate about these things, aren't we?
Yeah. Thank you, GU, for the $10 super chat. Just before everybody has to go real quick. Highly underrated channel you have here, guys. Keep up the good work. It'll continue to grow. Glory to God. Thank you, GU, for the super chat. We really, really appreciate that, brother.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, that should do it. So yeah, thank you everybody, David and Tyler, for joining me on Real Seekers and Faith Unaltered as well. So yeah, it was a great show, and have a great week.
Thanks, Dale. You too, buddy.
Thank you.